In this How to Play Chess video, I'll be covering how the pieces move and all the rules of the game. So this is intended for anyone who wants to get started playing chess but hasn't yet learned how to play. Chess is a game for two players. It's played on a chess board with chess pieces. The first player is called white, the second player is called black. White controls the white pieces and black controls the black pieces. Both sets of pieces are identical except for the color. The chessboard is made up of light squares and dark squares. So the players and the pieces are called white and black, but the squares on the board are called light and dark. Please use the proper terminology. The square in the lower right-hand corner of the board should be a light-colored square. If it's a dark-colored square, you'll just need to rotate the board. Remember, light on the right. Now, if you're playing on a computer, then you don't need to worry about that because everything's going to be set up automatically for you. I'm playing on a chess website called lichess.org. I highly recommend it, and it's completely free.
This is not a paid advertisement or endorsement. The beliefs, views, and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent official policy or position of Lichess or any of its clients. Some conditions, terms, and restrictions may apply.
On the chessboard, the vertical rows of squares going up and down are called files. The horizontal rows are called ranks. These letters and numbers that you see along the edge of the board are the labels for the files and ranks. So this is the E file, and this is the fourth rank. The square on which these two lines intersect is called the E4 square. So each square also has a name or a label. This is the starting position. It's how the pieces are set up at the beginning of the game. Let's take a look at the pieces. Starting in the corner, we have the rook, then the knight, bishop, king, and queen. On this side, we have another rook, knight, and bishop, and these are all pawns. The king and the queen both start on the two center files. Which goes on which square? Queen goes on her color. The white queen goes on a light square, the black queen goes on a dark square, and the king goes on the other square. But the way I like to remember is that both kings start on the E file and both queens start on the D file. If you want to be a serious player, then you should remember it that way too. Now we're going to learn how the pieces move. The rook moves up, down, right, and left. The bishop moves diagonally, and the queen moves in any direction, like the rook and bishop combined. So these three pieces, the rook, bishop, and queen, are all similar in a couple ways. They all move in a straight line, and they can all move as far as they want to go, so long as their path is not blocked by another piece. So, for example, this rook can move to any of these squares, right? Now, if I were to place a bishop here, then the rook can no longer move to here or here because the bishop is in the way. It's blocking the path of the rook. Furthermore, the rook cannot move here because there's a piece here already. You can't fit two pieces on one square. However, if this is your opponent's piece, then you can move there. You can capture that piece by moving to the square that's occupied by your opponent's piece. And so that's how captures are made. You move your piece like the piece normally moves to where it lands on one of your opponent's pieces. The captured piece is removed from the board and is no longer in play. The knight is the only piece that doesn't move in a straight line. It moves like an L. The knight can move to any of these 8 squares. Pause the video and gaze at the screen for a few moments if you like. So the knight can go 2 squares down and 1 square to the right, or 2 squares down and 1 square to the left, or 1 square down and 2 to the left, or 1 to the left and 2 down, or 2 to the left and 1 down, 2 to the left and 1 up, 1 to the left and 2 up, 1 up and 2 left, 2 up and 1 left, 2 up, 1 right, 1 up, 2 right, 1 right, 2 up, 2 right, 1 up, 2 right, 1 down, 1 right, 2 down, 1 down, 2 down, 1 square. So it moves like an L, and that L might be sideways, upside down and backwards, or flipped in any possible way. So this knight has 8 squares it can move to, but a knight in the corner has only 2 squares it can move to. Okay. Anyway, whatever. That's how the knight moves. Now, another thing about the knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. Its path cannot be blocked by other pieces, so this knight can move here. Just because a knight jumps over other pieces doesn't mean you capture those pieces. To capture a piece, you still have to land on it. The knight can also jump over friendly pieces, so at the beginning of the game, the knight is the only piece that can move on the first move. Besides the pawns. Pawns can also move. All the other pieces are blocked by the pawns. But we haven't covered how the pawns move yet, so let's cover that now. The pawn is the only piece that does not move the same way that it captures. The pawn moves one square directly forward, but it captures one square diagonally forward. It can't move diagonally forward unless it's capturing a piece on one of those two squares. And it can only move directly forward if that square is empty. It can't capture a piece that's directly in front of it. So this pawn cannot make a move. It's blocked by the knight in front of it, and there's nothing in front of it diagonally for it to capture. If I put a piece here, though, now the pawn can capture the rook, and that's the only move it can make. If the knight's out of the way, then the pawn can move forward or capture the rook. If the knight's here, the pawn can move forward or take either piece. So that's the normal way that pawns move and capture. I say normal because there's more to the pawn, so let's continue. On a pawn's first move, it can move two squares forward. Not just the first move of the game, but any pawn that's still on its original square can move two squares forward. It can also move one square forward like normal, so you have a choice, one square forward or two squares forward. And if there's pieces it can capture, then those are also options. So this pawn has four possible moves. On a pawn's first move, it cannot capture like this. Or like this. If it's going to move two squares, it has to be two squares directly forward. And those two squares have to be empty. After a pawn has made its first move, it can only move one square at a time. So what happens when a pawn reaches the other end of the board? It turns into a queen. This is called pawn promotion. The pawn is promoted to either a queen, rook, knight, or bishop. So it doesn't have to be a queen, but it's usually promoted to a queen because the queen is the most powerful piece. But sometimes it's better to promote to something other than a queen. If you can promote all 8 of your pawns, you can get 8 additional queens. Good luck with that one, though. Next, we're going to learn a weird move called en passant. It's a different way that a pawn can capture another pawn, and it works like this. If an enemy pawn moves 2 squares forward on its first move and lands directly next to one of your pawns, then you can capture that pawn as if it had only moved 1 square forward by moving your pawn to the square that the enemy pawn has passed through. So you're not landing directly on the pawn. You're landing on the square that the pawn has passed through. Also, the capture must be made on the move immediately following black's pawn move. So black moves 2 squares forward. If we want to make this en passant capture, we have to do it this move. Otherwise, we lose our opportunity. So if we don't do it this move, say we move the king instead, then black moves, now it's too late to make this en passant capture. We can't do it because we didn't do it right away. In this position, if black moves 1 square forward, white cannot capture en passant because the black pawn did not move 2 squares forward. It only moved 1 square forward. So the only time you can capture en passant is on the move immediately following one of your opponent's pawns moving 2 squares forward. And both pawns are on the same rank and on adjacent files. That means files that are right next to each other. So that's en passant. And so that's going to pretty much wrap it up for the pawn. And now we're going to learn the last piece, the king. The king moves 1 square in any direction, and he captures the same way. Pretty clear, simple, and straightforward. There's more about the king that we need to talk about. But first, let's cover how turns work. At the beginning of the game, white makes the first move. Then black moves, then white moves, then black moves, and both players alternate back and forth, taking their turns and making their moves on the board. When it's your turn, you can make 1 move. You have to make 1 move. No more, no less. Then your turn is over, and it's the other player's turn to move. And you continue like this for the rest of the game. Taking your turn and making your move mean the exact same thing. So now you know how turns work. The object of the game is to checkmate your opponent's king. In this next section, we'll be covering check, checkmate, and stalemate. Check is a term that means a king is being attacked by an enemy piece. In this position, if black moves here, the bishop is attacking the king, so the king is in check. Attacking doesn't mean capturing, it means threatening to capture. The bishop is threatening to capture the king. But kings are actually never captured. There's always going to be a white king and a black king on the board during a real game. So in this position, there's several other ways that black can check the white king. The bishop can move here and check at close range. Black can move the rook here and give check. The knight can check. The queen can check here or here. This pawn can check, and this pawn can check. Any piece can check, except the king. A king cannot check another king. Let me explain why. There's only one rule in chess, and that rule is, at the end of your turn, you cannot be in check. Otherwise, your move is illegal. So that just means if you're in check, you have to get out of check. And if you're not in check, you can't move into check. In this position, it's white to move. White is not in check. White cannot move here, because then he'll be in check from the rook. For the same reason, he can't move here or here. Also, white cannot move this pawn. Moving this pawn would expose the king to check from the bishop. So moving into check is illegal. And so that's the reason why I said a king cannot check another king. For a king to attack another piece, he would have to be one square away. The white king cannot move here. If he were to move here and check the black king, then the black king would also be checking the white king. Remember that rule I told you about? At the end of your turn, you cannot be in check. So moving here breaks that rule, because it results in your own king being in check. Both kings cannot be in check at the same time. If they are, it means somebody made an illegal move. So neither king can step too close to the other king. They have to maintain a separation of at least one square between them. Otherwise, they would be moving into check from the other king. In this position, black moves here, checking the white king. White cannot ignore the check and make a move that leaves the king in check. The king must be removed from check. And so that's the reason why I said kings are never captured. It's because you're not allowed to let your opponent capture your king. When you're in check, there's up to 3 possible ways to get out of check. As we've already seen, we can move the king to safety. You can block the check with another piece. Or you can capture the piece that's giving check. So these are the 3 ways to get out of check. You're not always going to have all 3 options. Sometimes you won't have any options, and no matter what move you make, you'll still be in check. That's called checkmate. In this position, black moves here, check. And no matter where the white king moves, he'll still be in check from one of the 2 rooks. And so this is called checkmate. The game is over, black wins, no further moves are played. So the king is never captured, it's only checkmated. If we were to carry the game out for another move, then I guess the king would be captured. But the game ends at checkmate. So again, checkmate is when you're in check, and no matter what move you make, you'll still be in check. So in other words, there's no way to get out of check. Okay, so that's checkmate. Now we're going to cover stalemate. If the rook moves down here, now this is called stalemate. So just like checkmate, the king cannot make a legal move. Any move the king makes would be moving into check. But in stalemate, the king is not in check, and in checkmate, the king is in check. That's the difference. Also, a stalemate ends the game in a draw. So in this position, it's white to move, and white cannot make a legal move, and white is not in check, so it's stalemate. The game is over, it's a draw. Nobody wins, nobody loses. Just because the king can't move doesn't necessarily make it a stalemate. It's only a stalemate if no legal move can be played. So if there's another piece on the board that can be moved, then it's not a stalemate. Like in this position, white has a pawn that can be moved. So it's not a stalemate because white can move the pawn. It's usually not good to stalemate your opponent because you only get a draw. You want to get a win, so you should be aiming for checkmate. Now that we've covered checkmate and stalemate, let's go through a few examples to solidify your understanding. In this position, if the queen moves here, it's a stalemate. The queen covers all these squares, and the king covers this square. The black king is not in check, and black cannot make a legal move because any move black makes would be moving into check. So it's a stalemate. Now, if black had another piece that he could move, then it wouldn't be stalemate. Like here, black has a pawn move available. So black's only move is to move the pawn. So it's not stalemate. He would have to move the pawn. If instead the queen moves here, then this is checkmate. The king cannot escape the check from the queen. And the king cannot take the queen because then he'll be in check from the white king. So this is checkmate. Also, if the queen moved here, that would also be checkmate. In this position, if the rook moves here, it's stalemate. The black king cannot move, and he's not in check, so it's stalemate. If instead the rook moves here, then it's checkmate. Remember, the king cannot step towards the white king, because then he'll be in check from the white king. The king is in check from the rook, and the king cannot move here because he'll still be in check from the rook. So this is checkmate. In this position, if the king moves here, then it's stalemate. The pawn covers these two squares, the king covers these two squares, and the king protects the pawn. The black king is not in check, so it's stalemate. If instead white plays this move, then this is checkmate. The bishop gives check, and it covers this square. The pawn still covers these two squares. The king covers this square, and it protects the pawn. And the black king is in check, so it's checkmate. In this position, if white pushes the pawn and promotes to a queen, then it's stalemate, because the black king has nowhere to go. If instead the pawn promotes to a rook, then it's not stalemate, because the black king has two moves that it can make, and white will go on to win this game in a few more moves. So this is the final example of checkmate. So if you're winning the game, then stalemating your opponent is bad because you want to win the game, not draw the game. Stalemate usually happens by accident because a player fails to recognize that the move is stalemate until after the move is made, and then it's too late. It can be very frustrating when you stalemate your opponent by accident. Now we're going to cover castling. It's another weird move. Castling is the only move where you move two pieces in one turn, in one move. Castling is one move, but two pieces get moved. And those two pieces are always going to be your king and one of your rooks. In order to castle, both your king and the rook that you're castling with must have not yet moved during the game at all. And therefore, they'll both still be on their original squares. So here's how castling works. The king moves two squares towards the rook. 1, 2. And the rook moves to the other side of the king, to the square that the king passed through. Now to castle with the other rook, the king still moves two squares, and the rook is going to move to the square that the king passes through. So like this, 1, 2, and the rook moves to the other side of the king. So sometimes the rook moves two squares, and sometimes the rook moves three squares, depending on which side you castle. But the king always moves two squares. Now there's a couple situations in which you cannot castle. 1. If your king is in check, then you cannot castle. You can't castle to get out of check. 2. If the square that the king passes through is under attack by an enemy piece, then you cannot castle. You cannot castle through check. So in this position, you can't castle this way, but you could castle the other way with the other rook, because the king is not passing through check. The rook here is passing through a square that's under attack, and that's fine. That's not a problem. But the king cannot castle through check, and the king cannot castle if he's in check. And you can't castle into check, obviously. You can only castle once per game, because once you've castled, you've moved your king. If this rook moves during the game and then moves back to its original square, you cannot castle with that rook because the rook has moved. But you can still castle with the other rook as long as that rook and the king have not yet moved. So that's castling. Before we end this video, I would like to briefly explain a couple more ways that a game can end in a draw. We've already covered stalemate, and we've gone through a few examples. Another way is called insufficient material. That's when neither player has enough pieces on the board to checkmate the other player. If all the pieces get traded off except for the two kings, then that's an automatic draw because a king by himself cannot checkmate the other king. The last way to draw that I would like to cover is called mutual agreement. Either player can offer their opponent a draw. Their opponent can then either accept the draw, decline the draw, or they can think about it. Or they can just make a move, and that's another way of declining the draw. There are a couple more ways to draw, but I don't want to overload you with too much information, so we'll cover those in a separate video. You already know more than enough to get started.
This is going to conclude the video. Thank you for watching, and that's it. Okay, bye.